Tessa is taking her first trip to Seattle. She snaps open her Surface and searches Expedia for flights. Within minutes, she's booked on Alaska Airlines. Next up, a few necessities. Tessa orders a suitcase from Amazon and new boots from REI. An Eddie Bauer jacket completes the must-haves. Boots on, ready to go. Tessa grabs a Starbucks, extra hot Americano, then boards her Boeing 737. Seattle-bound, Tessa whiles away the flight with old friends, Nirvana, Heart, Sir Mix-a-Lot, soon to touch down in one of the most innovative cities in the world. This visit to Seattle is made possible by Seattle, because Seattle changed the world. In its early decades, Seattle was thought of as somewhere, as in somewhere else. Out of focus, off the grid, out of mind. Seattle was America's postage stamp, stuck to the map in the upper left-hand corner. Seen as Alaska South, same trees, same fish. Sure, people lived out there, but were they really important people? Doing important things? The year Washington became a state, in 1889, Seattle did make national headlines, when much of it burned to the ground. What a mess. The city and the state were actually moving backwards, further from the modern world. They had a long way to go. But then, Seattle started to move. Early on, that meant normal things like a public hospital, a library, streetcar line. But then Seattle got bolder, knocking down huge hills across town, cutting canals between lakes, putting up the West Coast's first skyscraper. But moving forward meant much more than just building new structures. Seattle adopted a state of mind, a continuous mental exercise turning imagination into action, action into progress. A mission emerged: invent and innovate. Seattleites began writing their own rule book. Don't follow others. Punch above your weight and never stop, never. Seattle's legacy is a litany of global brands and accomplishments that the world knows.
Did Seattle change the world? I know it changed my world, and I bet you could go halfway around the world and find that anyone you ran into, their lives would be materially different because of innovations that came directly from this community.
Because at every point, Seattle saw opportunity and said, hey, we can do that. We can solve that. And we can do better. And Seattle did. Out of necessity, Seattle has always been about moving things and moving people. Starting in the mid-1800s, you'd find workers entering Elliott Bay from as far away as China and Japan. Logs rolling down to the waterfront, thousands of gold prospectors shipping out to seek their fortunes in the Yukon.
Seattle as a community was born with the notion of inventing something new. The future would be about new technologies, new transportation systems, new ways of doing business.
But the world changes, and no company can afford to stand still, not if you want to stick around for more than a century. 3 Seattle transport companies have surpassed that milestone, but not without adapting. After a national rail line finally reached Seattle in 1893, William Piggott had an idea. In 1905, he designed a way to load massive logs safely and efficiently onto flatbed rail cars. 3 years later, his company, eventually to be known as PACCAR, was selling commuter train cars to China. Business boomed, but the Great Depression took a toll. As people lost jobs and homes nationwide, the company had to find a way to keep going.
I sometimes think that adversity is the best goad for innovation. And sometimes when it's hard, that's when innovation really flourishes. But you do have to have that basic optimism and confidence.
For Piggott's company, that meant building a foundry that turned out 1,500 Sherman tanks during World War II. And decades later, made the transport mechanism that moved space shuttles to the launch pad. After the war, interstate highways changed the nature of transport, so the company pivoted again. It shut down rail operations, replacing them with production of highly rated Peterbilt and Kenworth truck lines. At the same time Piggott was thinking about his first rail car, teenagers Claude Ryan and Jim Casey borrowed $100 and set up a small Seattle messenger service in the basement of a saloon. Most messages went out on foot, but there were 2 bicycles and soon motorbikes. When the company moved to Model Ts, it became United Parcel Service and adopted its iconic brown color because that shade did the best job of concealing dirt. Package demand continued through World War II, and with men off to war, women seamlessly moved in. Today, UPS is the world's largest package delivery service, employing more than 500,000 workers in 220 countries, running its own fleet of cargo jets and delivering 25 million packages a day. However, if one name emerged to define transportation in Seattle and become a global game changer, it's Boeing.
Boeing stands out as basically creating the whole commercial airline industry, if you think about it. And I don't think there's any technology that's changed the world more than air travel.
Boeing changed the world. Boeing took us to the moon.
It all began with Bill Boeing taking a chance.
He dropped out of Yale. He was this very, went to finishing school, went to the Ivy Leagues. He was being groomed to be part of the East Coast elite.
But a voracious curiosity and sense of adventure drew him west.
Well, Seattle was still a frontier town, and so there was this pioneering spirit, this sense of it was good to take risks.
And Bill Boeing did, amassing a fortune in timber. Then, in 1915, he took a flight in a biplane over Lake Washington.
And then he got really, really crazy about airplanes. Learns to fly, and then a year later, he started his own float plane company on Lake Union.
And then he got lucky.
It's right time, right place. Bill Boeing started Boeing in 1916. The next year, the U.S. formally enters the First World War.
And so the company designed a training airplane that was called the Model C, and the Navy gave Boeing its very first contract for 50 of those trainers.
Still, after World War I and the arrival of the Depression, the company barely survived.
He had collected this wonderful staff of engineers and machinists and seamstresses, and he didn't want to let them go. So he paid them out of his own pocket. He kept everybody busy building furniture, building speedboats.
In 1927, Boeing began flying mail between San Francisco and Chicago, soon expanding flights to New York, creating America's first transcontinental airline, which continues today as United Airlines. And Boeing hired nurses to tend passengers, inventing the modern flight attendant. World War II would be pivotal as Boeing vastly expanded to support the military.
We were building bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-29 Super Fortresses. And Boeing employees, half of them Rosie the Riveters, did an incredible job of building these airplanes. The numbers they built were just mind-boggling. In April of 1944, they built 352 bombers in 1 month.
Bombers that were crucial to winning the war.
This was the most important program in the entire arsenal of democracy.
But Boeing also envisioned air travel for ordinary people, kick-starting the jet age in 1959 with the introduction of a Pan Am Boeing 707 that would spawn a family of planes and give Boeing commercial dominance for decades. The 60s were golden. In 1966 alone, Boeing built lunar orbiters began mapping the moon. The company won a government contract for a supersonic transport, the SST, and announced a radical new project.
The Boeing 747 ushers in a new age of jet travel.
Building a jumbo jet in the world's largest assembly plant just north of Seattle in Everett. The 747 flew its first commercial flight in 1970, forever changing the industry. But more hard times were looming. In 1971, Congress canceled the SST, and Boeing began slashing its workforce by 2/3. The gloom epitomized in a billboard. Will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights?
The workforce here at the Boeing company is expected to be whittled even more during the next year and 3 months.
60,000 people are out of work. And so Seattle just spirals into a worse 1970s than everywhere else, which is saying something. And people don't leave.
In fact, as we'll detail later, those laid-off workers will form the backbone of an entirely new sector of innovation in Seattle. Because that's the Seattle rulebook. Don't follow, punch above your weight, and never stop. PACCAR, UPS, and Boeing succeeded because they pivoted as circumstances changed, and through sheer determination, overcame odds that might have doomed other companies. In doing so, they moved the world closer together.
Everybody's planning to see Seattle's spectacular $100 million World's Fair.
So pack up your troubles and forget your cares. Pack up your family and head for the fair in Seattle.
Innovation takes courage, and courage often comes with audacity. The idea that Seattle could host a World's Fair was nothing if not audacious.
Civic leaders and business leaders got together and said, let's do something to put Seattle on the map internationally. And let's do that by creating a World's Fair that isn't just a World's Fair, but is focused far into the future.
And this was the boldest act in this little tiny jerkwater town, really. Seattle was a very provincial place in 1962.
And then we built that thing that we can see behind me, the Space Needle, which was perhaps almost accidentally, truly a symbol of the 21st century.
The fair also had a subtext, a separate reason for looking to the future. The Soviets had launched the first orbiting satellite in 1957, and the space race was on. Century 21 was a public response from America that said, "We're coming."
The U.S. Department of Commerce is vitally interested in science and the future. That's why we are now participating in the Century 21 exhibit in Seattle.
In effect, Seattle's fair began promoting STEM learning in schools half a century before the term was ever coined. The federal government contributed far more than it had in any previous fair, much more than either the city or the state. Spearheaded by civic booster Eddie Carlson, this audacious idea succeeded in every sense, attracting 10 million visitors. And unlike most fairs, it made money. But most importantly, it did put Seattle on the map.
A culture of innovation in Seattle did grow out of that secular fair and become very important to the explosion of innovation here.
He imbued a spirit in the city that said, we're about the future. We're about being more than we've been in the past.
As Seattle grew into a silicon forest, its tallest tree became Microsoft. The seeds had sprouted during that 62 World's Fair with its focus on the future.
And you have visitors like Bill Gates and Paul Allen, who said repeatedly in interviews later on that going to Century 21 changed their lives because it changed the way they thought about problems, how to think about them, how to pull them apart, and how to respond to them with innovation.
In 1975, Paul Allen saw a magazine cover which prompted a call to Gates. The former Lakeside school buddies could develop a basic software to instruct these new things called personal computers, a far different concept than a giant machine squatting awkwardly in the office.
It really takes a fresh look. I mean, you have to literally say, oh yeah, these guys have gotten so ingrained in how this should work that they missed this whole new approach.
They wrote their first program quickly, sold it to one hardware manufacturer, and set up Microsoft in Albuquerque, New Mexico to be close to that client. But it wasn't long until Seattle drew them back.
Sure, they're from here, coming home, but that wasn't the main reason. The main reason was there were engineers. They knew they could get like the people they needed. needed.
Such as graduates from the University of Washington's growing computer science department and engineers who'd lost jobs in the Boeing bust. The pool of talent is like catnip to Microsoft. Once back in Metro Seattle in 1979, the company's vision flows.
The computer is constantly improving. It's getting smaller. We're getting these flat screens with great resolution. We're trying to make handwriting be something you can use to get information into the computer, and eventually speech as well. So we're trying to make it fit in and have it be natural to use it. Eventually there'll be computers as small as your wallet.
Microsoft starts bundling word processing, spreadsheets, and presentation software under the Office label in the early 90s. Market share and revenue soar.
Microsoft was critical to what happened here in terms of the tech economy that we have now. Absolutely foundational.
But like every Seattle innovator, Microsoft hit speed bumps. Apple, whose first PCs had used a Microsoft operating system, became a full-throated rival. The government said Microsoft had grown too big and filed antitrust actions. And the company was late to the game in both web browser and cloud computing. Its mobile phone struck out. But Microsoft never stalls. It rises to become a symbol of Seattle's startup-friendly environment, prompting others to take the same chance. And just as Microsoft had once feasted on engineer-rich waters after the Boeing crash, someone later sees Microsoft as the source of talent he needs.
In fact, famously, Jeff Bezos drove out in his car with his business plan in his lap to Seattle because Microsoft was here and had created this great community. So while their businesses are different, one inspired the other.
Microsoft became generative, triggering startups and a family tree of its own. Two of those descendants made their way to the Fortune 500 list, each based in the Seattle area. In 1996, a Microsoft employee had pitched an idea directly to Gates. Let's eliminate travel agents. Let people book their own travel online. Gates said yes. The result? Expedia.
When that happens and people say, oh gosh, look what can happen if it actually works out. You can build the biggest company in this industry in the world, or the most significant company in that industry in the world.
Expedia quickly became an online giant, acquiring names like Travelocity, TripAdvisor, Trivago, and Orbitz, as well as European-based sites. And the man who made that initial pitch, Richard Barton, would go on to co-found Zillow, the most visited real estate website in America. Sometimes innovation is as simple as recognizing a great opportunity before anyone else. You might not know the name, but if you carry a mobile phone, in many ways, you have McCaw Cellular to thank.
The most probably dynamic technology in everybody's pocket all over the world today.
The McCaw's roots were in the small southwest Washington town of Centralia. In 1969, the four McCaw brothers inherited a tiny, troubled cable TV business from their father. Their mother wanted to sell, but the boys decided to run it. Led by Craig, the second oldest, they scrambled for years to grow the cable holdings. Then, in the early 80s, Craig McCaw learned the federal government was awarding licenses for portions of the radio spectrum that could connect mobile phones. AT&T passed, but McCaw saw those invisible airwaves as a conduit to the future.
I think Craig really had a vision. It was having a phone that was identified to a person. He said, we're not going to call places, we're going to call people.
In 1987, McCaw sold the cable business to pour the money into cellular, setting up headquarters in a Seattle suburb. Bob Ratliff recalls jetting around the country with the McCaws, buying up licenses.
I wouldn't say it was a sure bet. I mean, we certainly had tremendous pressure on us because of the debt that was assembled, but the debt made sense because of the fast growth of the industry.
McCaw was convinced success depended on linking together a network of cells.
If you had a Seattle phone and you went to Portland, it didn't work. But today you can go to Rome or Istanbul and dial that Seattle number and the phone rings.
McCaw's network, Cellular One, would become the largest in the nation, operating in more than 100 cities. Ironically, AT&T would eventually pay more than $15 billion for McCaw's interests, and many of the departing execs would go on to start new companies.
T-Mobile in the case of John Stanton, Edge Wireless, Madrona Ventures, Ignition Ventures, other Radio Frame, other little technology companies that became integral to the growth of cellular across the world.
A world that shifted dramatically when Craig McCaw took a fearless leap into the future.
We're on the very edge of that change, sweeping across society, and no one even understands what it means yet. And I don't know that we claim to know how many ways it will change society, but it will be profound.
I think there's 8 billion people in the world, and there's something like, 8 or 10 billion phones, and something like 80 or 90% of the population of the world now has access to cellular telephone technology. It's changed everything.
Seattle has produced many innovations that are helping the world, but less appreciated is what Seattle has given to the world. Many companies, organizations, and individuals are working to improve lives. But for our purposes, let's return to those two boys who were inspired by the World's Fair. Bill Gates and Melinda French Gates founded the world's largest philanthropic organization in 2000. Pouring billions into eradicating diseases like polio and malaria, lifting families out of poverty, and facilitating access to safe drinking water, saving millions of lives across the globe. During that time, Gates' friend Paul Allen was thinking on an even higher plane.
There's one scientist I met recently.
Allen believed the greatest mysteries in the universe exist not in the far reaches of space, but in the space between your ears, the brain.
If you start your career around computers and software and all that, computers think about problems a certain way. The human brain thinks about problems in ways we only understand a little bit.
To expand that understanding, in 2003, 15 years before he died, Paul Allen donated $100 million to create an institute committed to unlocking the brain's secrets.
We must invest in these scientists, researchers willing to pursue out-of-the-box approaches at the very edges of knowledge.
He had the ability to really see what that next step should be that would push the field forward. And at that time, everyone felt tackling the human brain was simply too hard.
That's because the human brain is a galaxy of billions of cells with trillions of connections. Much of how it functions is unknown, but neuroscientists do know humans and mice share 90% of their genes. So scientists at the Allen Institute began with the tiny mouse brain.
So the idea was, let's map all the genes across the entire brain. And this had never been done before.
It took the Institute's initial team of 80 scientists 3 years to produce the Mouse Brain Atlas, a groundbreaking 3D map detailing more than 20,000 genes in the brain. The atlas immediately became a go-to reference for researchers studying everything from autism to Alzheimer's to brain cancer.
I use the Mouse Brain Atlas every single day to ask the question, where is this gene normally expressed and how could it be playing a role in the growth of these tumors?
It's not just the Brain Atlas that's captured the world's attention. It's how the Institute handles all its scientific discoveries, putting them out there for anyone to use at no cost.
We have the resources to build things that are big, that are comprehensive, that are widely useful to many different scientists and different fields of science, and then we share it for free for anyone to use in their work.
The Brain Atlas is used daily by thousands of scientists in dozens of countries. And the Institute's model of big, team, open science is rapidly becoming the world standard. At this showcase, scientists share findings as they point toward the Institute's next goal, mapping in intricate detail the cells of an entire human brain and eventually finding cures for the most confounding mysteries of medicine.
And they can say, I'm interested in Parkinson's disease. I'm interested in schizophrenia. I'm interested in ALS. Well, let me look at this healthy brain and then look at my disease, and it can help light the way.
Thanks to Paul Allen's generosity and the power of teamwork, These breakthroughs in unlocking the brain just could be the most significant contribution Seattle has made to change the world. Seattle at your service. While many of our region's brands are instantly recognizable, there's a subtle influence at work, a philosophy that a person's experience is just as important as what they're buying.
You know, it's not a Seattle alone creation, but it is something where Seattle companies have really set the bar higher.
UW American history professor Margaret O'Mara believes it harkens back a century to Seattle's roots.
A small place with a vibrant retail economy, but probably where you're selling things to someone that you know, and maybe you want to, forge those keep those relationships vital, make sure that you have a good reputation.
Swedish immigrant John Nordstrom embraced that philosophy when in 1901 he partnered with a shoemaker he'd met in Alaska to open a store in downtown Seattle. Nordstrom famously said, "Customers will buy more when they are happy."
Nordstrom, sets itself apart from a very early stage when it's just a shoe seller as we're gonna, you don't like your shoe, we'll take it back. You wear your shoe, we'll take it back. And that's something that's setting it apart.
By 1960, that modest shoe store had grown to the largest in the nation, and a decade later, the company was selling a lot more than shoes, with sales surpassing $100 million. As Nordstrom expanded across North America, it spread its philosophy of going above and beyond. To this day, Nordstrom-level service is a business case study in how to win and keep customer loyalty. Another Seattle area retail brand has become a global juggernaut by offering customers an exemplary experience on a different level. Costco sells high-quality merchandise at bargain prices to card-carrying members. And like Nordstrom, will pretty much take anything back.
It's providing a level of customer satisfaction, whether it be I'm going to guarantee your products for a lifetime, or I'll take it back no matter what, or I'll give you a better price than you could get elsewhere.
Costco didn't invent the concept of a members-only warehouse store. That was Price Club in San Diego. But Jeff Brotman's father suggested his son replicate that model, and the lure of entrepreneurial life won out.
My dream was to not ever have to work for anyone, and I never did. Other than a very brief time working for the Attorney General of the state of Washington when I got out of law school, I never worked for anyone, and that was always my objective.
In 1983, Brotman and retail genius James Senegal teamed up to open the first Costco warehouse on 4th Avenue in Seattle. They shared a motto, do the right thing for customers and for employees, who they paid generously. It worked. Costco grew so fast, it became the first company ever to go from 0 to $3 billion in sales in under 6 years. You can now shop at Costco in more than 800 stores across the globe, from Australia to South Korea to Iceland. If Nordstrom and Costco elevated the consumer, Amazon took it to the stratosphere. It began in 1994 when Jeff Bezos quit his Wall Street job in New York to create an online store.
I made a list of 20 different products that you might be able to sell online and picked books as the first best product.
And he specifically chose Seattle.
Jeff Bezos coming out here, recognizing that Microsoft had succeeded here and continued to amplify the innovation economy here. Jeff Bezos thought this is the perfect place to build an entirely new digital commerce company, and what success they've had.
It wasn't a sure bet. Online shopping was new and untested in 1995 when Bezos launched his cyber bookstore from the garage of his suburban home. A bold risk.
Amazon used the World Wide Web in a way that no one had ever thought possible. It made consumers of the world's citizens.
Bezos did it by embracing Seattle's secret sauce, Gold Star customer service.
That's the only way for a small company like Amazon.com to compete against larger companies. You actually have to provide a better service.
Within 2 years, Amazon had a huge Seattle warehouse stocked with 2.5 million books and employees working round the clock shipping those books worldwide, many going out the day they were ordered.
Take two kind of basic business strategies. You can either be obsessed over your competitors or you can be obsessed over your customers. We think it's much better to be obsessed over customers.
With his unconventional laugh and dorm-style door desk, Bezos hardly fit the image of a business mogul.
Hi.
But in December 1999, Time magazine named him
the person of the year.
Amazon wasn't even turning a profit yet. Instead, pouring revenue into expanding its online offerings and distribution centers.
What we're trying to do is first and foremost be Earth's most customer-centric company. And then within that, we want to build a place where people can come to find and discover anything and everything that they might want to buy online.
What is this?
Here, let me show you. This is Cyclops.
Okay, they're going to take a picture of it on that camera. Okay, what do you do?
This is Cyclops. You just got one eye, that's why it's Cyclops. But you can go like this.
Oh, that's
shoot its
cool.
eyeball.
Bezos showed off some favorites on KOMO's Northwest Afternoon in February 2000.
So you just strap that on.
Including a human saddle. He actually demonstrates for the audience. The man with the goofy laugh who came to Seattle to take a risk is now one of the richest men in the world, and Amazon is bigger than Microsoft. Bezos embraced the impossible, even as critics predicted the company would fail. Quite simply, he saw a future others couldn't imagine. Innovation doesn't just work for business. It can also reinvent existing culture. Seattle's done that too. It's taken arts and customs, which have been around for centuries, added new life and new meaning, and announced them loudly across America, and in many cases, around the world. During the Second World War, rationing meant the U.S. learned to drink weak coffee, the result of too few beans and too much water. When Starbucks opened its first store in Seattle in 1971, it sold only roasted beans and brewing implements. That changed after Howard Schultz was hired and made a trip to Italy in 1983. He came home inspired. Starbucks could offer Americans a richer brew and the kind of coffeehouse experience he'd seen in Milan. There, people sat casually sipping espresso while chatting with friends. Starbucks could be reinvented as a third place, somewhere other than home or office to meet with friends.
The history of innovation in Seattle or anywhere is a history of pivots. It's an iterative history. It moves between applying the old to the new, adaptively reusing a technology or a lyric or a particular application in art to a new outcome.
Starbucks grew fast, but not without pauses. For example, the pandemic shifted business to carryout. But now customers are back in their third places. Starbucks is the world's largest coffee house, and its cultural vibe continues to spread. And Seattle didn't just reinvent culture in an espresso cup. It did the same thing in a red-hot kiln. Glassblowing dates back more than 2,000 years, but as a global art form, it came alive after 1971, when Tacoma-born UW grad Dale Chihuly opened the Pilchuck Glassblowing School about an hour north of Seattle.
Chihuly invited people from all over the world to come here. He invited the Italian glassblowers, and he invited the people from the Czech Republic and from Japan. And all of these people came together to really exchange ideas and techniques.
Chihuly took what was considered a fragile medium, glass, and pushed it to its limits. Not just displaying artworks on pedestals, but hanging them from ceilings, growing them like stalagmites, tossing them into water, weaving them through gardens. every installation telling a story.
He often talks about his mother and his mother's garden and the many, many flowers, the beautiful colors, and you see that reflected in this installation. If you go into the Sea Life Tower room, it reflects Dale Chihuly's love of the Puget Sound, of the water.
Unlike a novelist or composer, Chihuly's creations require teams of artists.
And what's great about Dale Chihuly's work and process is that he incorporates the intern who's learning glass for the first time and the master who's been doing it for 30 years. And that's really why people move here.
If you didn't have the torch to use, what would you have to do?
It's what lured Meany England to Seattle to do her work.
So what he did was kind of taught all of us how it's done, that you can do so much more if you are able to bring a big group of people together, bring lots of like-minded people together, you can accomplish so much more.
Chihuly put Seattle on the map as the center of glass blowing in America, and he's now the most famous glass artist in the world. Just a mile away from the modern Chihuly Museum is the venerable Pike Place Public Market, dating to 1907. Its impact, too, has been global. When the power brokers of Seattle moved to tear it down in the 60s and replace it with this, citizens rose up.
On the one side was the mayor, the city council, the two city newspapers. It was a who's who of Seattle. On the other side was this ragtag group of university professors, a few artists, and a lot of people who had shopped and loved the market.
The people staved off the wrecking ball. But Pike Place Market would not be what it is today without another Seattle breakthrough, one that changed the relationship between government and public markets. Under pressure from Washington's powerful U.S. Senator Warren Magnuson, the federal government agreed that money allocated to traditional urban renewal, demolition, could instead be used to restore and renew.
We were an international inspiration for markets all over the country and all over the world because, as you can imagine, we were not the only market that was being threatened by urban renewal at the time. So the market in Barcelona, which maybe you've been to, that's there in part because the Pike Place Market was saved.
And finally, Seattle's eclectic musical heritage created a vibe that's influenced artists worldwide. In the 40s, Seattle had developed a thriving jazz club scene. Three teens, Quincy Jones, Ernestine Anderson, and Ray Charles, would lie about their ages to sneak into those clubs. Ernestine was already making her name when she met Ray Charles, just arrived from Florida.
And I thought, but if I could go to a medium-sized town and start to do my own little thing, maybe I could make it. And so I selected Seattle. It took me 5 days on a bus to get here.
At the age of 16, Ray Charles was performing at a Seattle club when a 14-year-old trumpeter approached him. His name, Quincy Jones. A talented performer, Jones would become one of the most celebrated music producers, composers, and arrangers of all time, winning 28 Grammys. Here he is in 1983, working with Michael Jackson in the studio. Jones produced Jackson's mega hit Thriller, the best-selling album of all time. But the linchpin of Seattle's musical culture was created back in 1931 when Paul Tutmark invented the electric bass guitar in his basement. Creative mastermind Jimi Hendrix would mesmerize a generation in 1969 with his electric guitar performance of the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock. Back then, rock music was a male-dominated genre. But Seattle sisters Ann and Nancy Wilson broke that barrier. Their first album, Heart, released in 1985, went platinum 5 times over.
We're just going to play some concerts in Seattle and then do a West Coast tour and then do
That's right.
another album and then do a film and then do a tour and then do an album and a film and an album and a film and an album and a film and an album.
In the late 80s, Seattle's love affair with the electric guitar hit its high note with the birth of grunge. Groups like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Soundgarden rode a wave of popularity with their angst-filled lyrics and fusion of punk and heavy metal. It became known as the Seattle Sound. That same decade, Seattle defied the odds by creating a thriving hip-hop scene, beginning with Sir Mix-a-Lot, who was just gaining traction when he appeared on TV with KOMO's own Steve Poole.
Yo, check this out. He's on the weather forecast, so check this out. It's my time to get on the camera. No, wait a minute. Get him out of my way.
Mix-a-Lot's upbeat lyrics and sense of humor set him apart and defined his brand.
With funky ideas, new jazz singers plus the ultimate in cool, the devastating rapper MC Steve Poole. Front runners, the title of the show. The KOMO posse is always on the go.
It's like end of the city lights.
Rapper Macklemore would follow in Mix-a-Lot's footsteps, achieving international stardom without being signed by a major record label. From jazz to hip-hop, rock to grunge, Seattle musicians forged new paths, reinvented genres, and inspired other artists around the world to do the same.
I've been to Spain, I've been to Tokyo.
While music influenced Seattle's soul, nature has shaped its spirit. The raw power of nature was on display for the world when Mount St. Helens blew its top in 1980. Mud flows from melting ice and snow swept away giant trees and even buildings. While the eruption occurred in southwest Washington, ash landed as far away as Oklahoma, and the plume encircled the globe. The blast could stand as a metaphor for how nature has infused Seattle with a fierce resiliency.
When you come into a community that is surrounded by the densest forests on Earth and has some of the highest peaks and fjords that are as deep as those in Scandinavia, you need to have a spirit that says, I can deal with this and I can find a new way.
One of the people who found a new way was Eddie Bauer. Prompted by a rainy fishing trip in 1936, during which Bauer nearly died of hypothermia, he bought $25 worth of goose down, stuffed it into a quilted jacket, and was soon selling his invention in his downtown Seattle store. In just 4 years, Bauer took out more than 20 patents for clothing and equipment, and he boldly guaranteed his products for life. But sometimes it's not what you sell, but how you sell it that's a game changer.
REI, notably, that's founded in 1938 as a cooperative where a group of people who love to hike and love to mountaineer. All the gear was really expensive and hard to find, and you had to get it from Switzerland, and it was not something that was easily available. So they created a cooperative where they're, rather than a business owned by a single person, but it's something where everyone shares in their profits.
The fee to join REI in 1938, $1. $1 for a lifetime membership. REI's first store manager was Northwest mountaineering legend Jim Whitaker, who would later become the first American to summit Mount Everest in 1963. But beyond helping extreme sports enthusiasts stay alive, together REI and Eddie Bauer changed the way many people around the world connect to the outdoors. Adventure isn't just for the wealthy and privileged. With the right gear, anyone can venture out. Because along with its many peaks and lakes, Seattle is also known for rain and clouds. And for dynamic airflows that split around mountains and gather over Puget Sound.
I love the idea of thinking of it as a convergence zone. We think of the convergence zone as where weather systems come together and create something different. This is a place where ideas come together.
Aside from Mount St. Helens, there's another mountain that has a profound impact on Seattle's spirit, Mount Ranier. Locals call it the mountain because it dominates the skyline, its grandeur suggesting endless possibilities. In any season, when the mountain and sun come out together, so do the people. They head to the hills to ski, mountain bike, or to gaze at waterfalls. Others seek out water to paddleboard, kayak, or float around in donut boats under the mesmerizing Seattle skyline.
People want to come here from all over the world, and that is also generating that part of the energy and the dynamism, and that's where the new ideas come from.
Sometimes those new ideas are quirky. Ever heard of pickleball? It was created by happenstance on an island 30 minutes by ferry from Seattle. U.S. Congressman Joel Pritchard from Washington would take his family to Bainbridge Island for the summer. His oldest son, Frank, was a teenager then.
I didn't want to go over there. All my friends, my school friends, were in Seattle.
The family picnics, boating, walks on the beach did not impress the kids.
It was a beautiful day. I'm standing on the steps, and I turned to him and I said, I hate it here. There's nothing to do. And he said, when we were kids here, we used to make games up. And I said, oh, really? Why don't you go make a game up then?
So Pritchard did, enlisting his friends Bill Bell and Barney McCallum to invent a game that could be played on a scruffy badminton court. Pickleball became a smash hit. It's the fastest growing sport in America and has spread to dozens of countries, from Spain to India to Argentina. Recently, the governor declared pickleball the official sport of Washington State.
London can have Wimbledon. Rome can have the Colosseum. We have the epicenter of the sporting world today at the pickleball court, where it all started on Bainbridge Island.
Out of boredom, adventure. Out of a problem, creative genius. Seattle area companies, organizations, and people have already changed the world, and it's not over. The legacy continues. For evidence, look no further than the University of Washington.
Across every kind of creativity and innovation, the University of Washington is a seedbed. It is an encouragement, it is a leader, it is a collaborator.
Recently, UW was ranked the 6th best university in the world, and separately, the top public university in the world for innovation, #1.
You publish research in archival papers, but sometimes you want to translate it and make your discoveries, change the world.
It was UW's reputation that drew Alex Rosenberg of Chicago and Charlie Rocco of Virginia.
I actually didn't know the University of Washington was in Seattle when I applied. I knew it was somewhere in the state of Washington, really? But yeah.
The two now run a company called Parse Biosciences, spun out of their UW research involving a cutting-edge technique called single-cell RNA sequencing. They didn't invent the sequencing itself, but developed a technology to do it on a large scale using only a small kit instead of expensive special instrumentation.
We ended up getting hundreds and hundreds of labs reaching out to us from across the world here.
By the end of it, it was actually a little over 1,000 labs that had requested help on how to get this up and running in their own facility.
And it was pretty clear, we had to commercialize this.
But how? They had no idea how to move forward. The answer was a long-standing UW program called KOMO, which offers everything from a physical space in a startup incubator to advice and community connections.
Having a space where you're with other startups that are going through the same process and being able to do this in a supportive community, that was huge for us.
We are sort of the liaison for interactions with VCs, angels, law firms, and other experts that might help them scale their business.
Parse Biosciences is already having a global impact on research into cures for cancer, Alzheimer's, and infectious diseases.
At the end of the day, we empower researchers to save lives.
And Parse Biosciences is no one-off. KOMO incubates roughly 100 startups a year in its 3 labs. Startups like Anavasi Diagnostics, whose founders invented a PCR quality rapid test for COVID. Essentially, it's a lab in a box.
Our test uses a chemistry that's similar to lab tests that's very sensitive so that we can get better performance, yet we can keep the cost low and get rapid turnaround.
Most importantly, Anavasi is expanding its tests to include detection of influenza, RSV, and Mpox, with potentially life-saving consequences. But Seattle isn't just known for innovation in science and technology, but also in the arts, especially the art of eating. 2 decades ago, Seattle entrepreneur Kurt Dammeier decided Seattle needed a signature cheese. So he consulted with experts.
They told me, no, that's not a very good idea. In fact, cheese is going the wrong way. Consumption of cheese is declining, and this is probably not a very good business.
In true Seattle fashion, Dammeier wasn't deterred. He invented an artisan cheese he named Beechers Flagship.
We use the techniques of making cheddar, but we add a culture from the Swiss tradition called Helveticus.
It wasn't just the recipe that was magic, but Dammeier's vision for where he set up his cheese-making operation.
Opening it in the middle of a city and having it grow to become a brand that is as deeply loved as Beechers could only happen in Seattle. And it could only really happen at Pike Place Market.
At historic Pike Place, foodies from the Pacific Northwest mingle with tourists from around the globe, and Beechers gets a lot of attention.
We're now making cheese in 3 locations, and we'll probably make something like 5 million pounds of cheese this year.
Beechers' world-famous mac and cheese is now sold in every state and 12,000 grocery stores across America. A few miles away, in Seattle's Central District, a new restaurant is gaining global attention. Communion was recently named one of the top 12 best new restaurants in the world. Chef Christy Brown describes her style as Seattle soul.
Man, I just fell in love with this. I feel like a lot of times food is used to separate people, but actually it so works together. And so you might say, oh, fish sauce and barbecue sauce, that doesn't make any sense, but it totally does.
Brown took a big risk opening her restaurant just as the pandemic hit. Located in a building that once housed the first Black-owned bank in the Pacific Northwest, Communion is as much about community as food.
Us being here says, hey, there's a chance for us all to coexist together.
As we talk about Seattle's fabled brands and breakthroughs, questions arise. Why? Why did it happen here? Is there some magic fairy dust? We hear from experts who've studied it from the outside and lived it from the inside.
You know, what I think of when I think of Seattle as a birthplace of innovation is that because we are so far removed from the rest of the populated parts of the United States, that we have a welcoming attitude toward newcomers. We have a flat social hierarchy. You don't have to be from a famous family or come with great wealth.
It seemed like a place you could do anything. If you could just find the right people, find the right resources, find the right problem to solve.
People who live in Seattle, they really want to live in Seattle.
Seattle has everything. It has mountains, it has water, it has great people.
I think Seattle definitely has a bit of a kind of renegade feel that, you know, probably still persists.
I'm not a very good employee, and I also have a lot of harebrained ideas.
I think it was okay in a different way than if those people had been in Los Angeles or New York or Chicago. All wonderful places, but is it okay to be a little wacky, different, and weird? In Seattle, it's actually pretty okay to be that way.
I think Seattle did and does have the draw of newness, and part of that is being on the edge. I mean, being on the edge, you have to dive or you fall. It's one or the other.
I would call it an innovation ecology. There is an ecology here where a healthy innovator propagates other healthy innovators.
People who are entrepreneurs are people who can embrace innovation and embrace what's good about it and embrace what's scary about it. Because it is scary to fall short.
Most of the ideas I have aren't great. Or they have some limitation. Or somebody else had a better idea. It was a fantastic idea, only somebody else had a better idea. Well, that still affects my idea. So inventing is a game where a
fantastic batting average is still a very small number.
Enlist as many people as you can to help to get you on your next step, and know that whatever that idea is, it's not crazy until you say it is.
You can try something new, and you're going to find like-minded people. So you're going to collaborate, and not just with people like you.
People are willing and wanting to collaborate with one another, and they did that way before it was popular to do so.
This place is distinctive. It's on the edge. It couldn't be more dramatic. It's a liminal space between land and water that draws people from the east and the west. You can walk for half an hour and the rhythm of your feet is the rhythm of your thinking. It's hard to do in many cities of the world.
So many other cities around the world would love to know the magic fairy dust. And to this day, we'll have delegations of groups from around the world, business groups, civic leaders who will come and, ask me the same question. How does Seattle do it? Is it the rain? Is it the coffee? Is it, what's going on?
We've seen how Seattle has moved the needle the world over. But writing our future, are we still an audacious city determined to lead, not follow? Futurist Glenn Heemstra has made a career out of advising communities on the importance of finding their guiding star.
What Seattle could really use right now would be a cohesive, ambitious vision of its long-term future. The act of people coming together and saying, in my dream, we would look like this and we'd have these features, the act of doing that creates an almost mystical sense of purpose that pulls people forward. I think it does matter that a city decides what it wants to be. It's not easy to do because, of course, cities are collections of all kinds of people who want to be all kinds of things.
And there's no question Seattle has problems to solve. Yet historians who've studied the city's remarkable track record remain encouraged.
The history of Seattle is a history of change, and it has not been an unparalleled march of progress. There have been tough times in the past. There have been tough times in the recent past. There will be tough times in the future, but there have been great times in the past and great times in the recent past, and there will be great times in the future.
I think that the wonderful thing about Seattle is it's young enough so that we're all writing stories still. I mean, all of our children of people that have raised them here in Seattle will have a chance to write stories.
So I'm optimistic, and I'm especially optimistic because I see young kids come in here, and I see them look at the innovations of 100 years ago or even 200 years ago, innovations that were created by the indigenous community, and they get that look in their eye and they say, you know what? I can do the next innovation. I can be that person that helps build the future. That fills me with optimism.
Optimism is a hallmark of creators. They see a problem, and instead of feeling discouraged, they're energized by a curiosity to invent solutions.
We're not the biggest city in the world population-wise, but we punch way above our weight. And I think that we can feel very, very proud of that. And I don't see any reason why that won't continue into the future. In fact, I would say that if we're looking for what they call superstar cities on the global scene, Seattle is one. I think it will stay one. And I think, honestly, it's up to us to make sure that that happens.
In the end, the bottom line is a philosophical one. Does Seattle, the city that once told the world, we're coming, we're about the future, still want to be that scrappy city on the edge of the continent that doesn't follow, aims higher, and never stops?
How Seattle Changed the World is the brainchild of Steve Poole, KOMO's lead weatherman for over 40 years. Steve gave Seattle the weather forecast, but he also gave us the chance to meet some of the area's most famous innovators before they were famous. Steve's keen interest in Seattle innovation continues to inspire, and we thank Steve for his legacy, passion, and commitments to Western Washington.
How Seattle Changed the World is sponsored in part by the Museum of History and Industries, Seattle.